All right, continuing our discussion of photosynthesis, the next thing we need to establish is chloroplast structure. Once again, chloroplasts are the organelles in which photosynthesis takes place. And so we tend to find in tissues that are responsible for photosynthesis, we find cells that will have numerous chloroplasts in them, average 75, as it says in your notes, to around 125 or so per cell. So it's important to keep in mind this is an organelle. This is not a cell. This is actually found within a cell. So let's talk about the structure. As you can see, there is a multi-membrane structure going on here with a chloroplast. We've got the outer membrane here, which is thought to have originated in evolutionary terms from the endoplasmic reticulum. And the general thinking on that is that at one time, this inner membrane was the membrane of a bacteria called a cyanobacteria, which photosynthesizes, of which there are still many today. And the idea is that what became eventually a plant cell sort of entered a symbiotic relationship with one of these bacteria and engulfed it in some of its own ER and basically allowed it to start living inside of itself. Then you find immediately inside of it what we call naturally the inner membrane. And then inside of the inner membrane, we have further structure in the chloroplast as well. But for starters, we've got a space between the inner membrane and the structures inside of it. We've got this colorless liquid part of the chloroplast that's called the stroma. And the stroma contains a few things. For the most part, it contains a lot of enzymes, and we'll talk about some of those enzymes specifically in the coming modules here. But it often also includes starch grains. And if we look at a photograph from an actual microscopic view of a chloroplast, such as these two chloroplasts here, we see these dark regions, dark little spheres in the chloroplast, and these are starch grains. Starch is just a more complex form of carbohydrate than sugar, and when photosynthesis is going like gangbusters, they tend to accumulate a lot of sugars, and there are enzymes in that stroma that will start converting these sugars into long chains of sugars, which take the form of starch. So back to our structure of the chloroplast, that covers the stroma. Within the stroma, we find some convoluted membranes, and they're all interconnected. And what's important to note here is that these membranes actually divide an area separate from the stroma within the interior of the chloroplast. And so these inner membranes here, which we would call thylakoid membranes, form little stacks of look like little buttons or little pillows, and each of those little pillows is called a thylakoid, and they are hollow. Inside of the thylakoids, the hollow space, which is full of fluids as well, is referred to as the lumen. Now, a stack of these thylakoids is referred to, as it says here, as a granum, and it's important to note that the granum or grana plural, a granum is singular, is one stack. But all of these stacks here are all linked together. Okay? So in other words, all this membrane that makes up all these little thylakoids and the individual grana stacks, as you can see is depicted here, they are all interconnected. And this is extremely important when we get to the chemistry of the rest of this process. The first part of what we call the light reactions, which we'll talk about next, occurs in the thylakoids. And we've already talked about pigments. Within these thylakoid membranes of these grana, or these stacks of thylakoids, are where we find all of the pigments. And these pigments, we'll say pigments, are grouped together within the thylakoid membrane, or membranes, I should say. into what we call photosystems. Let me scroll down a little bit more here. A photosystem is simply a group of pigments. And so once again, looking at the actual photo here, now that we've defined some of these other terms, we can see in this region here, we've got what we would call a granum, which is a stack of thylakoids. And so one of these little stacks here, these are in a different orientation than the actual drawing there. We kind of turned 90 degrees, but one of these folds in here is a thylakoid.